Hi, and welcome back to It's Not History, the podcast where the past is never dead. It's not even past. Episode 9, Paxton. So, sometime in 1728, James Logan in Philadelphia wrote to friends about some trouble he was having in Lancaster County. Trouble with inhabitants, new inhabitants. He wrote, quote, "Vast numbers of newcomers and encroachers are making settlements on any vacant lands that are of any value." And even worse, from Logan's perspective, these settlers weren't paying for the land, making them squatters. And according to Logan, the new squatters were going to keep on refusing to pay rent until, as he put it, your dispute is resolved. The dispute coming from, as he delicately tiptoed around the issue, the differences arising in the family. The family and the friends were the Penns. Specifically, Thomas Penn, John Penn, and Richard Penn. And the differences arising in the family was actually closer to a blood feud. Because after decades of orderly treaties and negotiations and purchases under William Penn, the founder and father, the Penn family suddenly found themselves caught in a crisis worthy of a reality TV show. William Penn, the father, had acquired vast stretches of land, 29 million acres, the largest land grant in the world, as you recall. And with his right-hand man, the secretary of the provincial government, who was James Logan, all went great for about the first 30 years or so, until it didn't. When Penn died in 1718, he died without leaving a will, which, given his vast holdings, was kind of problematic. Not a problem if he was a man with a clear heir and a straightforward family, but of course he wasn't. He had 17 children by 2 separate marriages, of whom 7 were still around when he died in 1718. And he died, leaving no instructions, other than the implicit, "Not my problem anymore, you guys sort it out." So that's what they tried to do, just not very well or not very fast. From the time of his death, it took 13 years for the notoriously and evidently slow Chancery Court in London to sort it all out. And so with no one person with clear authority to call the shots, this put the land office in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia into turmoil. And in the middle of all this crisis was Logan. He served as secretary, which was the highest administration official, from 1701, and he'd continue to hold that post until 1732. He managed the land purchases, the Indian affairs, pretty much everything. And this enabled him, Logan, to amass a fortune. Kevin Kenny in Peaceable Kingdom lost the Paxton Boys in the destruction of William Penn's holy experiment rights. Logan acquired a near monopoly over the fur trade, importing goods from England and selling them on credit to traders who exchanged the goods for Indian pelts. The traders then sold these pelts to Logan, repaying their debt with interest. Logan exported the pelts to Europe and imported more goods for sale to the Indians and the traders. So basically, every part of the economic ecosystem in early Pennsylvania was in one way or another done through Logan. More to the point, he made money at every point in the money pipeline, from the land being sold to the guns and powder going to settlers and Indians, and then to the furs going back to England, and then getting paid back with interest. Nice work, if you can get it. The problem was that this season of succession featuring the Penn family was making it difficult for Logan to sort out the land bit, and that made it difficult to sort out the trade bit and the fur bit and every other bit. And at the root of this, as we saw in the last episode, was the ongoing festering border conflict between the colonial governments of Maryland and Pennsylvania over who controlled the lower Susquehanna Valley and access to the Chesapeake Bay. Penn claimed ownership. In his view, he had purchased it fairly from the Susquehannock, and he had a receipt to prove it. Maryland, Lord Calvert, claimed that he owned it, and that anyhow, the Susquehannock were all dead, and so how could you buy it from them? And, if all this just sounds like an effete squabble among elite men in ruffled shirts and shoes with buckles, it wasn't. The conflict turned into a shooting war of prolonged violence over what was yet another bizarre instance of settler-on-settler violence, and this one was known as Cresap's War. And it was going to fester until the issue was finally resolved by 2 surveyors who definitively established the border between Maryland and Pennsylvania, in 1767 in a border that took their name, the Mason-Dixon line. In the meantime, no Native Americans were going to get involved in this. No way they were going to sell land to anyone until the colonists got their act together. And this was a healthy instinct, given that in a few years, Logan and Thomas Penn would be behind the infamous Walking Purchase, the largest land fraud of the era. So native Pennsylvanians put an embargo on all land sales. The store was effectively closed. And so in this spirit of never letting a crisis go to waste, a new wave of migrants flooded into Pennsylvania. Many, most in fact, came from the southern Palatinate region of Germany, and most were some form of religious asylum seeker. Drawn by the Peaceable Kingdom of Pennsylvania and the Quaker traditions of inclusion and tolerance, Lutherans, Calvinists, Anabaptists, and Mennonites and Moravians flooded in. So many, in fact, that by 1759, 30% of this English colony would actually be German-speaking. And so the Germans in Pennsylvania mostly settled on farms in the plains of Lancaster County, some of the richest, most productive farmland anywhere, and found where they wanted to be. James Logan described the, quote, general appearance of plenty and neatness in everything that belongs to them. Sturdy houses, prosperous farms, well-kept orchards bordered by high, straight fences. Stereotypical Germans being stereotypically German. They established pious, self-sufficient communities and stayed put. Many are still there, the same communities, and in some cases, same houses even. Others came from the counties of Ulster and Northern Ireland. They were also, as Presbyterians, religious minorities in their homelands, first Scotland and then Ireland. They'd migrated there and formed a buffer between the Anglican English, who established dominance over the Catholic Irish during the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and 89. And there, on the frontier of the English Empire, they set up farms and acted as the first line of defense against external threat. So this space at the edge of the British colony of Pennsylvania, this tenuous middle ground between cultures, between settlers and the displaced, for this newest group of colonists, the Scots-Irish, occupying this space physically, culturally, is nothing new. In fact, it's how they came to be. It's their origin story. Because 100 years before, on the other side of the Atlantic, they were an engineered solution to a similar problem. So their role in Pennsylvania is to them a familiar one.
Yeah, I think it is a familiar role, and it's a very striking history, because in the 1690s, around the time when William Penn is setting up his colony, the first movement is from Scotland to Ulster.
This is Kevin Kenny, professor of history at New York University and author of Peaceable Kingdom Lost, The Paxton Boys and the Destruction of William Penn's Holy Experiment.
As part of the formal plantation of Ireland, and about half of them come as part of a formally orchestrated plantation, which dispossesses the Catholic population. The other half sense opportunity, and they just move there. Within a generation or two, their descendants are making the same kind of move for the same kind of reasons, to do with availability of land and to do with religious toleration, to be able to practice their religion as they see fit. And now they're moving to the Americas. They come first to Boston, and you might think that as fellow Protestant radicals, as dissenters, that the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists might get along. Well, they didn't. They quarreled, and Presbyterians from Ulster were not very welcome in Boston. And so they first began to move out a little to western Massachusetts. They moved up into present-day New Hampshire, where you see towns like Belfast and Londonderry if you drive through that part of the country today. But then they moved overwhelmingly to the Delaware ports and into Philadelphia. So actually, Pennsylvania as a peaceable kingdom is initially more peaceful than other colonies, because it doesn't have an army, it doesn't have a militia. It depends actually on high-level negotiations with powerful Native American groups, especially the Iroquois Confederacy, to keep the peace. And it becomes a sordid story of expropriating Native American land in ways we can discuss, but it is a peaceable kingdom in that sense of the absence of war and plunder and conquest. until the middle of the 18th century. So it's hard to wrap our minds around many of these things. But once the migrants from Ulster enter the story, then the picture changes, because about half of them, and these are Ulster Presbyterians, these are the ancestors of the people who become known in America as the Scots-Irish. And it's not a bad term, because they are Irish, but they are themselves descended from Scottish settlers who came to Ireland during the plantation of Ulster in the north of Ireland in the 17th century, looking for religious toleration and land. And clearly they didn't find it to the extent they were seeking, because they were Presbyterians, if you like, Protestants of the wrong kind. They didn't belong to the established Anglican Church. And so their children and their grandchildren migrated once again. So the original settlement had been from Scotland to Ulster, and then their children and grandchildren migrate to Pennsylvania in search of religious toleration and in search of land. Now, land, that four-letter word, is the key to so much of our understanding of history, and it's very true in the 18th century, because about half of the Ulster Presbyterians who came settled around Philadelphia. But the other half moved west, and they moved west to Paxton, just out beyond Lancaster, out to the Susquehanna River area. And that was the frontier in 18th century Pennsylvania. It's only 100 miles west of Philadelphia, but that was, the term frontier is taken from the sources in the 18th century. And that was where the zone of European settlement ended and came into contact with the lands west of the Susquehanna River that were still heavily populated by the Native American population as it was being moved west. Okay, so what the Ulster settlers did out there was they paid no regard, many of them, to the land title of the Penn family or the land claims of Native Americans.
The new residents of the frontier soon lived up to expectations. In 1763, Logan wrote to one of his bosses, Thomas Penn, that a, quote, panel of disorderly people from two heavily Ulster communities close to Paxton had moved south and possessed themselves of all of Conestoga Manor. Conestoga Manor was part of the 500-acre tract that William Penn had granted the Conestoga Susquehannock in 1701, and far, far southeast of Paxton, more than 40 miles. The Paxtons were getting out of their box and going in the wrong direction. This wasn't the hard-scrabble frontier highlands along the middle Susquehanna. This was fertile land in the middle of the plains of Lancaster County. Logan wrote, "This is the most audacious attack that has ever been offered." So what had inspired this audacious attack? These Ulster settlers, Logan explained to Penn, believed that it was, quote, against the laws of nature and God to leave land idle when it was needed by hungry Christians. In the minds of the Paxton, this was idle Indian land, laying fallow, and just waiting for someone to make it into productive farmland, which is what they planned to do. Treaties or title be damned. And, true to form, they didn't ask permission. In spite of this, Logan thought that they might have their uses. Kevin Kenny writes, although he despised the newcomers' manners and religion and was alarmed by their violation of land policy, he saw clear advantages in directing them toward the outlying areas between the province's German and Indian population. Logan advised that it might be wise to plant a settlement of such men as those who have formerly so bravely defended Derry and Enniskillen as a frontier in case of any disturbance. Recounting the Irish phase of the Glorious Revolution in 1688 and 1689. Yet Logan could not help concluding that Ulster settlers had caused more problems than they had solved. The Scots-Irish settlements stood in stark contrast to everything around them. Kevin Kenny writes, on the frontier, Ulster settlers often built single-room houses without furnished floors or roofs. These rudimentary structures were intended as temporary dwellings by squatters who had no title to the land. Even when they rented or owned land legally, they usually didn't intend to stay long. Taking advantage of the absence of government on the frontier, they claimed title to their land by, quote, tomahawk rights.
They simply came onto the land, they took out a tomahawk, they carved their initials in a tree, they walked to another tree, they demarcated their territory through what was called tomahawk right. So they did not respect the right of occupancy of the native population, and they disregarded the title to land that the Penn family had acquired and would have sold to them. They said, no, squatters' rights. This is ours. We're taking it. Try and stop us.
Logan's disdain of the Ulster Irish was more than a little ironic, given the fact that he, Logan, was also from Ulster, Scots-Irish even. Born in Ulster to Scottish parents and educated in Edinburgh, Scotland. So, from the same place geographically, but worlds apart, culturally and socially. He, Logan, was the established order, the ruling elite. Arguably, in the vacuum left by William Penn, the ruler. They, the Paxtons, in Logan's mind, were marginal people living on marginal land in transient communities.
It looks like, from an elite perspective, it looks messy, it looks untidy. You've got burned tree stumps in the middle of a forest. What is going on? Don't these people know how to farm? On a pragmatic basis, it's an effective way of growing a small amount of, say, oats and other crops for consumption on a temporary basis, with the view of carving out a space where you can live for a few years and then maybe moving on again.
These temporary dwellings and practically expedient farms showed that the Scots-Irish, in contrast to the Germans, were going places. And this dynamic was to be the seed that germinates into one of the conflicts at the center of the story. Because the Scots-Irish here, now, in the early 1700s, stand in stark contrast to everything around them. The German Palatates, the Quaker English, had found a place and made peace with it. The Scots-Irish were not at peace. They were driven. And that drive, west, with intent, real violent intent, starts here.
Movement is such a feature of this culture. They continued to move, and they settled in this rough and ready way, often exerting squatters' rights on land in what was then western Pennsylvania, but it's really just on either side of the Susquehanna River in Lancaster and Cumberland counties. And then, perhaps even more remarkably, they continued the migration south through Maryland, Virginia, into the Carolinas, all the way down to Georgia, eventually out into the new states of Kentucky and Tennessee, to the extent that one historian says if you're looking for a map of the frontier at the time of the American Revolution, well, you're going to find it where the Scots-Irish are, in central Pennsylvania, the parts of Pennsylvania we're talking about, and then all the way down through the backcountry, and occupying this distinctive buffer position between a dispossessed population and a Protestant elite to which they don't quite belong. The propensity to move in search of land that you can stake a claim to owning rather than renting, even if you seize it. The propensity to do that and to carve out a space where you can practice your Presbyterian faith without interference, the very strong attribute of this migration.
At the center of these new isolated communities on the edge of the English-speaking world was the Presbyterian Church. And at the center of the church was the minister. It was a role of real influence and authority. And these were, for a time, the only thing approaching a municipal government in these communities. Kevin Kenny writes, Presbyterian ministers exerted an extraordinary degree of authority among Ulster settlers in Pennsylvania. In an emerging frontier society where civil jurisdiction was at a minimum, they often provided the only stable source of authority. On both sides of the Susquehanna River, churches were erected and congregations recognized, long before townships and counties were marked out. Presbyterian sessions not only governed their own internal religious and secular affairs, but they regulated the morality in their community and adjudicated arguments between church members, secular and religious. They investigated marital disputes, illicit sexual relations, domestic violence, dishonest business dealings, pretty much everything. These sessions took evidence from witnesses, ruled on guilt or innocence, and doled out punishments. The most onerous being exclusion from worship and the sacraments. The capacity of the Presbyterian Church to function as both moral arbiter and court of law meant that it not only formed the basis of the community, it was initially the only form of effective government on the frontier. So at the center of the community along the Susquehanna, at the new township of Paxton, was the Paxton Presbyterian Church. And at the center of the church was the minister. And the minister was the Reverend John Elder, a man we'll hear about more, much more, soon.
In the early 1700s, about 1715, Scots-Irish settlers primarily moved into the Paxton area, killed or drove out the Indians who had a substantial settlement there, and took over. They never established a government. They didn't have a real town center. Just a bunch of people, mostly Presbyterians, mostly Scots-Irish, living in the same place.
This is Jack Brubaker, journalist and historian in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and author of Massacre of the Conestoga, on the trail of the Paxton Boys in Lancaster County.
They had their churches, but they didn't have any government leadership. It was just a group of people of like mind, but a fairly strong group of people. The Penns put the Scots-Irish on the periphery of the settled area because they knew Scots-Irish were good fighters. So they pushed the Scots-Irish out to the frontier to fight the Indians if necessary. And that's one of the reasons they were on the western fringe of Lancaster County in Donegal and farther south.
In 1750, this space inhabited by the Scots-Irish settlers was still a fragile middle ground in the middle of a colony, in the middle of two cultures. And tragically, that middle would not hold, for reasons that had nothing to do with either the Paxtons or the Conestoga. Because in 1755, the First World War was started by an insignificant man from Virginia in a largely trivial incident in a place few people had ever heard of. So join us next week as we explore a conflict that would serve as the catalyst for the first two American wars of independence. A conflict started by a man who would miraculously survive not one, but two of the worst defeats in the history of the British Army, and then survived to be at the center of a third war of independence. This minor and lucky British officer is, of course, Lieutenant Colonel George Washington. I'd like to thank our guests this week, Jack Brubaker and Kevin Kenny. You can find a link to their work and others at my show notes at itsnothistory.com. Thanks for listening.